Hey everyone, welcome to day 2 of our Lunch and Learn series. Yesterday's session on Advocacy 101 was recorded, and so we'll share that along with the slides. And today's session will be recorded, and we are so grateful to have Alice and Ricky here today with us from LatinxEd to talk about undocumented students and kind of the work that they do. And tomorrow will be Zanaya Lewis and the folks they're from the Yes She Can campaign, and their work is called Discolored. It's about scholarship displacement. Tomorrow's session will not be recorded, but we will send out links to all of their information so that if you have questions tomorrow about the scholarship displacement work, we will make sure that we send that to you as well. So without further ado, one of my favorite people, Alice Dolbow, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of the work that you all do? And we'll hope that Ricky joins us when he can.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think I've got all my screens and all the things. I still am not sure I have the chat pulled up, so I do appreciate your
support
with that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alice Dolbow, and I am the partnerships coordinator for LatinxEd. I see a few familiar names. I guess I can't say faces because I can't see folks, but I can see a few familiar names among the attendees. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to choose this SACAC session. Really grateful to Deb and Jane Ann for their work with the advocacy arm of SACAC to help push forward some important initiatives and just thoughts to our legislators. And I will be joined by Ricky Hurtado momentarily. You see his little headshot right there. Oh, I think he is joining now. But I can start just real briefly while he's joining to tell you a little bit about LatinxEd, if it's not an organization you're familiar with. We were founded in 2018, and so we are rapidly approaching our 5th birthday. And LatinxEd invests in Latinx leadership to expand educational equity and opportunity in North Carolina. We envision culturally sustaining education systems that recognize, meet, and honor the diverse needs of Latinx immigrant families. And we do that in a few different ways, some of which we'll talk about today. And one of those ways is by really looking at the intersection of education and immigration and supporting undocumented students and students from mixed status families who also identify as Latinx. So we'll share a little bit more as we go on. And I'm going to pause for a second and see if Ricky is in fact with us.
He is.
He is. Wonderful.
I'm in fact here. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here with SACAC once again.
Welcome back. We're so happy to see you.
And Ricky, I'm sharing my screen, so I am happy to be the slide remote control.
Gotcha.
So I will let you introduce yourself and then start in on our presentation.
Great. Thanks, Alice. And thanks everyone again for hosting LatinxEd today for this conversation. I've met a lot of you. I'm Ricky Hurtado. I'm the co-founder of LatinxEd and currently serve in the capacity as senior advisor, helping guide our development efforts and strategic efforts across the state. I also served as a House representative for 2 years, representing Alamance County, which is where I live currently in Graham, North Carolina. If any of you are in Alamance County, what's up? Unfortunately, I'm no longer there, but our advocacy work continues to make sure that we're building a more equitable education system for everyone in North Carolina, especially immigrant families, which is who we work with. Alice, I don't know if you shared anything else around our presentation, or if we're ready to just dive right in.
Let's dive right in. So.
Perfect. Well, we have a few updates, and we're certainly going to take advantage of the opportunity of having an audience to sort of talk about what we've been up to over the last 2 years. Actually, it's pretty amazing how fast time has been flying by with some of our work. But when we were asked to come present, I think a lot of what we wanted to talk about, which we certainly won't have enough time to cover is the work that we've been doing through Somos NC, which was a statewide listening tour. Some of you may have even participated in this tour. And the reason this tour sort of came to mind to cover it today is because part of our motivations of having this statewide listening tour was the belief that the Latino or Latinx communities' voices weren't being heard on the topic of education. That's largely why LatinxEd exists as an organization and a core part of our mission. And we wanted to make sure that in any conversations we're having, whether it's at the local, regional, or statewide level, that we have opportunities to make sure that Latinx students and families' voices influence sort of how we think about promising practices and also policy agendas when it comes to advocacy across the state. And so we embarked on a statewide listening tour, rather ambitious, if you want to go to the next slide, Alice, where it gave us an opportunity to talk to community members, to families, to institutions. And so we actually road tripped across North Carolina. We made 10 in-person stops. A lot of those were community colleges and universities. We had virtual roundtables. This was very much in the midst of COVID. And so we took advantage of our virtual roundtable opportunities and hosted over 18 roundtables, and also interviewed one-on-one interviews with community leaders across the state, and we ended up talking to 51 people. So in total, we ended up touching about 250 people, I think is the final tally. And if you want to go to the next slide, Alice, that 250 people covered over 36 counties. And so we covered a large swath of North Carolina. We divided the state by prosperity zones, which I think unless you work at Commerce, you probably don't know what a prosperity zone is. It's a rather wonky designation, right? But this map sort of presents to you what those prosperity zones essentially entail, which divides the state up into 8 different sort of economic hubs, right? Economic regions of workforce regions. And so yeah, we still a lot to go, right? 36 is not 100, but we definitely recognize that 36 is definitely a good beginning to have these conversations, and also where the majority of Latinx students are currently in North Carolina, so largely where we focused our efforts as we toured the state. If you want to go to the next slide. A lot of what we heard wasn't new to us, but it was certainly humbling to hear the different experiences across North Carolina. If you take a look at our report, so what ended up happening with the Somos NC listening tour is that we took these findings, all these conversations, and LatinxEd published its first report, which was the Somos NC listening tour report. And you can find it on our website at LatinxEd.org. You can download the report there, use it. And we know a lot of educators that have already been using it as learning opportunities among their staff, and to sort of think about how they're serving Latinx students in their communities. 4 themes largely sort of was lifted up throughout these conversations that we felt were common across experiences in the state. Those 4 being chronic disinvestment in Latinx education, and sort of the belief, both perceived and actual, that there's just not enough resources invested in bilingual and bicultural access in schools. Another theme that we heard that resonated across the board, that will certainly resonate with this group, is just the real barriers to post-secondary education, and the continued conversation around tuition equity for undocumented students, and just access in general for mixed status families. So students who may be U.S. citizens, but whose parents are residents or undocumented, or have another sort of immigration status that prevents them from navigating smoothly through the college admissions process. Or is it really smooth for everyone? I don't know, but that's another conversation. The third topic was about cultural and social isolation in schools. And so we know mental health and the youth mental health crisis is very real for every single student in our schools, whether public or private, and sort of how you navigated the pandemic. But we saw this sort of acutely impact Latinx students, and sort of how they talked about not just the social isolation that they experienced because of their removal from services and a community, and just generally what happened over the last few years, but also the cultural isolation, which was also highlighted and exacerbated during COVID, where it felt that their identities and their just lack of representation in schools and sort of shared lived experience really made it difficult, even whether once they got back in the classrooms to sort of share so much of sort of what was impacting them, right? And so that cultural and social isolation certainly was not a new phenomena, but certainly exacerbated during COVID. And the last piece was the issue of representation and just the absence of Latinx education and leaders in our community that are focusing on education. And that's something that came up often for the participants of this tour. And so we highlight these conversations in depth in the report. If you can't tell, I'm plugging the report over and over because we want y'all to read it. So check these out. These 4 themes are sort of cover the bulk of this report. And at the end of it, we also offer at least some recommendations on how LatinxEd is thinking about moving forward. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Alice. And these largely line up with a policy agenda, a statewide policy agenda on sort of things that are impacting the Latinx community at large. And so part of that work is directly related to education, things such as the Leandro case that continues to sort of get ping pong in courts and in the legislature around fully funding schools. That seems to have a big impact on not just sort of teacher quality and availability in schools, but also resources such as mental health and social emotional health resources that students are crying for, and we're not quite listening to them. Other issues such as sort of teacher diversity, right? The DRIVE task force at the statewide level has been doing a lot of that work. And it's a task force that has advanced the conversation, but that hasn't quite been able to get its teeth into legislation just because of differing philosophies among the majority party on whether a focus on diversity and inclusion is needed in education. Again, another conversation for another time, or maybe this is a time, who knows, we'll see where SACAC wants me to go. But that's certainly a part of the conversation that is very much prevalent within the Latinx community too. Tuition equity, and it was a conversation that we have talked about previously and a conversation that we've talked about at length. Unless there's new folks in the room, I think we know this topic very well. I mean, the fight around tuition equity, or making sure that immigrant students, regardless of immigration status, get access to in-state tuition in North Carolina, especially if they graduated from a North Carolina school, has been a topic of conversation among education advocates for 20 years now. And the irony of it is that I know if you've been following the legislature closely, there isn't exactly high hopes for getting any promising legislation such as tuition equity passed this year, given the challenging political environment that exists in both the Senate and the House. And a conversation we can have actually is that there had at least been some conversation that a tuition equity bill will be introduced by the Republican senators this year, and that might actually get some traction if we get the right folks at the table, especially from the business community. And so I did not think that I would be forcefully, vocally advocating for tuition equity in 2023 in a year that didn't seem like there was a lot of promising political wins for this community, but there might be opportunities, and I think an opportunity for SACAC to make their voice heard. I think Alice may plug or we can chat a little bit about some advocacy days that are coming up here in the next few months. But definitely SACAC as a community should definitely rally around the topic of tuition equity, because I think it's actually a conversation that's happening in the Senate right now, and we'll need to find some promising, some legislative champions on the House side too, to make sure that we can get that across the finish line. So yeah, I guess my takeaway there is, for the first time in like a decade, we may actually have some real traction on this issue this year. So stay tuned there. And the last issue I wanted to bring up before I pass it over to Alice is just the issue of driver's license for immigrants. That is not necessarily a topic we talk about a lot among education circles, but certainly a topic that is the #1 policy issue among immigrant communities, and a topic that is fought for year in and year out by many Latino serving and immigrant serving organizations and grassroots groups across the state. And it does have impacts in education, and we're starting to see this firsthand, especially now that DACA has been frozen. And we're starting to see not just parents of students being impacted, but also students who are turning 16 and do not have access to driver's license in North Carolina because of these strict rules around who has access to driver's license, who doesn't. And so certainly something that we should be thinking about as education advocates, because it impacts transportation, not just to K through 12 opportunities, but to after school, extracurriculars, and then eventually to post-secondary opportunities as you think about where you have access to go to college. And so certainly an issue that is impacting educational outcomes for an entire community, and not something that gets enough talking points within a conversation when we think about what access looks like for the immigrant community. And so I'll pause there and toss it to Alice, unless I forgot something, she will remind me quickly. But yeah, we encourage you to read this report and encourage you to have further dialogue with LatinxEd if you wanted to talk more about what this looks like in your community, or if we can offer other existing resources that I think that Alice is going to talk about soon. But yeah, thanks again for having us.
Thank you, Ricky. And I'm not going to go to the next slide yet, because I love the driver's license issue. For me, a couple of things that come up when you're doing RDS for a mixed status family, and you have a US citizen student and there is no driver's license number for the parent. It's yet another checkpoint. There's no validation with the DMV because the parent is undocumented. And so as I think, the high school counselors on this call certainly know that if you have a US citizen student with undocumented parents, you are often in the position of having to do an RDS appeal to get their rightful in-state status. And, driver's licenses could help the RDS system if their undocumented parents could have access to that. And I was in a training, and I'll tell you about those trainings in a bit, but we got in a discussion about, again, US citizen kids accessing driver's licenses. You need to be supervised for 60 hours by a licensed driver, a licensed adult. And so, when I don't think kids want to lie and mess with the DMV, right, and say that they had a licensed adult supervising them. But, there's a lot of students in our classrooms and in our schools who might have difficulty meeting those permit hours because their parents don't have driver's licenses, right? And so then you think like, oh, they can get a license, at least the citizen students can. But if they don't have an adult who has a license, that's another barrier. And that actually, I have a child who just went through the driver's education program. So this became very real in my house. And, was thinking, again, when you have the privilege of citizenship, you don't often think about the myriad ways that not having that privilege can impact your daily life. So we do want to say a little bit about undocumented students and some of the things that we're trying to do and some of the ways that you can plug into our work. I do want to say, I always want to say, yes, we work with Latinx students, but undocumentation is not just a Latinx issue. Not all Latinx people are undocumented, not all undocumented people are Latinx. That said, the majority of undocumented folks in our state will identify as Latinx, but it is certainly not 100% overlap. So when you look here, a few years ago, they finally did like an actual new statistical analysis and said that there's about 98,000 high school students who are undocumented graduating across the country each year, and 3,000 of those are in North Carolina. And I think that puts us right around like top 7 or 8 in terms of states. And to the point about driver's licenses, but also just college choice. Looking at that second statistic there, that over 200,000 children in North Carolina have at least one undocumented family member. That could be a parent, it could be an older sibling, could be a grandparent or an aunt or uncle. And 8% of all children in North Carolina have at least one undocumented parent. I've already mentioned the RDS system. We also know FAFSA is more challenging if the parent does not have a social security number, regardless of their legal presence and lawful status. Not having a social security number makes that more difficult. And so that's 8% of all children in our state. What's a really interesting statistic to me is if you then just look at children in immigrant families. So you take all those children, reduce it to just the children that are in immigrant families. 47% of children in immigrant families are children of undocumented parents. So in your counseling office, on your caseload, in your orientation program, in your classroom, if you have a child in North Carolina who is from an immigrant family, there's nearly a 50-50 chance that their parent or parents are undocumented. So it is quite a common experience for our Latinx students to navigate this mixed status environment. And so even though we've led the South as a destination for immigrants over the past quarter century, so even though we're seeing a generation now being here and children being born here, it certainly doesn't lessen the impact all the time, even for the students who have citizenship and all the privileges that come with that. I will also say I've been on some webinars with NCAN, and I don't know if any of you are part of NCAN. It's the National College Attainment Network. So a lot of community-based organizations that work around college access and success are part of it. And they were having a FAFSA update. And I do not work for federal student aid. I guess this is being recorded, but don't share this recording. This was public knowledge. I just am not the expert here. Normally, if you don't have a social security number, you cannot create an FSA ID, you cannot sign your FAFSA electronically, right? So most of the students we work with do have undocumented parents, and they are having to mail that signature page to London, Kentucky, why of all places, to have their FAFSA processed. What they said on the NCAN webinar is that there's going to be no signature page and everyone's going to have an FSA ID. So I don't know how they are going to navigate that. I think that's part of the reason they're saying that maybe October 1st won't be the FAFSA open date. I will be very interested to see when you have undocumented parents who absolutely understandably are very skeptical of providing their information and may not have a lot of ways to validate their identity. I will be very interested to see if they can make that accessible. There are ways they could do that, certainly through tax ID numbers, but not all undocumented folks have an ITIN, a tax ID number either. So, I'm waiting to see. I'm glad that folks like those who work at NCAN are paying close attention to those kinds of issues. But again, the point here being undocumentation isn't just about tuition equity for undocumented students, but also for the impact that can have on the family unit. So one of the ways that we work to help folks, LatinxEd is a founding collaborator. I think Ricky was our founding collaborator with an initiative called Undocu Carolina that was founded in 2018. UNC faculty work on this, staff members work on this. Some of us from LatinxEd work on this, and then the Carolina Latinx Center. And it initially started as an initiative to increase support for students affected by undocumentation at UNC Chapel Hill. We all know there's very few undocumented students who can, number one, get admitted, because there's very few people who get admitted, right? It's just hard anyway. And they're in the out-of-state pool, so that's fun. Even if they're considered in the context of their in-state high school, they are thrown into that out-of-state pool because of their RDS. But then also paying, right? Because lack of tuition equity, tuition is 2.5 to 3 times what our in-state folks pay with zero financial aid. Carolina Covenant does not extend to undocumented students. Moorhead-Kane does not extend to undocumented students. So a lot of those types of things we think of do not extend to those students. So there are a handful of students funded through things like POG scholars, like the POG scholarship, Robertson Scholarship, Golden Door Scholarship, all of those are open to undocumented students, but it's still at the end of the day, not a huge number of students who are affected. So, I have my years off. In 2022, we launched. See, I was not prepared for the fact that this was 2023. Last year, a year ago, in 2022, LatinxEd really led the effort to bring Undocu Carolina training to our K-12 educators. We just wrapped up our last training of the spring this last Saturday. And you can see they're really excited that through the course of 5 sessions, we trained 118 educators from 24 distinct school districts. We hope to launch some training specifically for community colleges. Ricky mentioned that in the Somos NC tour, we talked to a lot of community colleges. That is where the vast majority of our undocumented students will find access to post-secondary education. There's amazing allies in our 58 community colleges. And so that is an area of growth for us. There are other universities that have their own kind of undocumented student support groups or initiatives. I see Shekinah here on the call. I don't know if you're still at App State, but App State has the Immigrant Mountaineers movement, which also does ally training. You know, we have started conversations with other private and public universities in the state who are interested in replicating the kind of stuff that we're doing through UNC Chapel Hill. But regardless of those university trainings, LatinxEd has the ability virtually, right, to offer these kinds of trainings in both in person and virtually to reach K-12 educators throughout the state. The picture here was actually one where we came in on an optional teacher workday for Jordan High School here in Durham Public Schools. The principal bought everybody breakfast. You know, we showed up with our workbooks and our slideshow. We have legal experts who do pro bono work, who come and share for an hour. We have student storytellers, we have facilitators. It's a really amazing thing. And for the K-12 educators, we've been able to offer CEUs. We have a partnership with Elon University and their School of Education, and they are able to approve that certification. So for those credits. So that's one way you can get involved. And the other, this is hot off the presses, y'all. This is like, we are here for this. We just opened up the application for our next cohort of LatinxEd fellows. Anyone who identifies as Latinx and kind of sees themselves as an education leader. You can be an education leader and be a student. You can be an education leader and be you know, working in the schools or working in the community. We want you to apply to the fellowship. This particular quote right here is from one of the student participants in our precursor to the fellowship and the impact that having that identity exploration and leadership development in a cohort of Latinx students, kind of going back to what Ricky was saying that we found in the report, that cultural and social isolation, being in a place where they are not feeling that, right? Where they're able to explore their identity in a culturally sustaining way. So you can nominate your, if any of you identify as Latina, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, whatever term fits for you, and you would like to apply. If you have colleagues who should be applying, if you have students who should be applying, please nominate them. There's a website there for the fellowship. You can email questions to my colleagues who have worked really hard on creating this. And we're really excited about what that's going to entail this summer. So those are some ways to get involved. You don't have to speak Spanish. You just have to identify as Latinx, and it's okay. All citizenship statuses and immigration statuses accepted. So that is kind of the end of our, I'm going to try to find my stop share button, or you can just take it away from me, Deb. That's also an option. Oh, there it is. So that's it for like our formal presentation, but we wanted to leave a good amount of time for questions and answers. You can grill Ricky. He's used to being on the hot seat, you know, whatever y'all need to do.
I have so many questions, but I want to make sure, folks, if you want to put questions into the Q&A, if you want to put questions into the chat and address them to the host and panelists, we can answer them. And until I see some stuff come up, I'm just going to ask questions if that sounds okay. So I'm just interested in all of the things. First question I'm really interested in is actually looking at that map. I'm a map girl. You can see behind this, like I have maps everywhere in my house. where is kind of the bulk of the, if you think about like the centers of the population that you primarily, or during the tour, right? And we're talking to you, like, where are some of those population centers that you really think need the most attention or get ignored, or, sort of where are some of those population centers?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here, and Alice, would love to hear your thoughts too. I mean, uh, I guess let me paint a picture first on sort of demographics of North
Yes.
Carolina, right? Because I think it's an important distinction on what's happening in North Carolina. I mean, you know, knowing the demographics of the state, you understand that our urban centers like Mecklenburg County, Wake County, Durham County, Guilford County, right, are not just the most populous in terms of people in general, but you would also find Latinx students and families being their numbers in terms of just raw numbers, right, being the highest in those areas. And so in our more urban areas, you see a lot more students in terms of quantity. But in my opinion, right, and a lot of where LatinxEd works is in more rural communities where there's less resources. And so the flip side of this, right, if you compare the top 10 counties in terms of raw population, right, you would see more urban areas. But then on the flip side of that, you begin to see places like Lee County, right, Clinton, Wilson, where the percentage of Latinx students and families that make up the overall population is higher, even if there's less people living there, if that makes sense. And so essentially what's happening, right, you get places like Siler City, North Carolina, that is a small town, right, of like 10, 15,000 people, but the majority of the population there is Latinx, right? It's like 60% Latino in Siler City. And so Sanford, for example, is where I grew up, so I talk about it often, is at this point over 25, 30% Latino, right? It's only a town of 30, 40,000 people at this point, but those numbers matter, right? Because I think it gives people an outsized sort of perception of not outsized, right? But I think the perception of how the Latinx community is impacting that community sort of varies depending on how visible or not visible they are, right? So it may be a little easier to sort of be a number in Charlotte versus what it means for that community to be present in Sanford, right? And so for me, I think a lot about those places in North Carolina where perhaps the politics and the infrastructure aren't as friendly to serve the needs of that community. I don't know if you would agree with that, Alice.
Yeah, I would. I mean, raw numbers, when you look at our college access program, I'll drop the link for that with a little brief description in a minute. College y Consejos. When you look at raw numbers, we see a ton of students from Wake County, for example. Well, Wake County in general has more immigrant-friendly local policies than a lot of our rural spaces, right? And so that certainly just has an impact on like sort of the anxiety level of the community there. But I think also in a place like Wake County, you have El Pueblo and like other cultural centers or organizations where in some of our rural spaces, some of the students that we work with really feel that isolation even more acutely, even though, like Ricky said, there's they're growing in that sort of percentage wise. I think there can still be like almost a more marked sense of isolation, at least when we are reading those college essays for those students and the things that they're telling us. And the other thing I would say is like when you look at our community colleges, our rural community colleges are the spaces where you're seeing, like, I think we have some emerging Hispanic serving institutions at the community college level, and they're in rural spaces. And so, I think that kind of lends support to what Ricky was saying.
I am about to start working with students at Columbia High School in Columbia, North Carolina, which is about an hour from me. It's on the way to Manio. Super small high school, early college, high school. They brought me in because they're having difficulty, just the school counselor, it's just trying to manage fires, right? They're trying to put out fires. And so I'm coming in to do a lot of the college access stuff. But when I sat down with them a couple weeks ago and listened to what their demographic is, it's exactly what you were saying, right? So very high population of Latino students and first gen. And so just the myriad problems that sort of come with first gen, undocumented, mixed families, like just the whole spectrum, all in this, centered in this one tiny school, and they don't have their own community college. So the closest community college for that county is Beaufort, which is where I am, which is in Washington. So it's an hour away. So they have to do all of these programs and sort of like, it's like you can go and you can sit in a classroom and have a teacher, but it's just the complexities, I think, are really eye-opening. And that's something that I've definitely discovered just I live in rural North Carolina now, just sort of seeing the number of obstacles that are socioeconomic, that are systemic barriers to access, that just so many, right? They just get piled on top of each other. And so I think that when you come from a place like Wake County, it just seems easier, right? Because there's just so many more resources. And so it's been really interesting to move into a very different space. And so the work that you're doing is just so important. And I think it's hard to remember how far reaching it can be, some of these issues in our state. Because again, if you live in Wake County, if you live in Mecklenburg, you're not in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina very much, right? Which is, it's some great stuff out here, but it is a very different space. And there's politically a very different space as well. I mean, I think that's the other piece of it too. Sorry, that I love this stuff. So other, I don't see any other questions, and so I'm just going to keep asking questions. I would love for you to speak to kind of two different populations. First is if you could speak to people who are working in admissions offices. So directly to, people who are working in any of the many 4-year, not 2-year, because I think that the community college systems, I worked at Wake Tech for a long time. It's a very different kind of piece. It's open enrollment. There's just a lot more understanding there of the different kinds of students that you're going to get. So 4-year college admissions offices. What are the things, if you could highlight some of the top things that you wish they knew, and policies that they could, even simple policies that they could institute that could maybe help that transition and that access become more feasible for students? What are some of the things? So that's the first population. I would love for you to sort of, you can just like, if you had like a top 5 list of like, this is what we could wish for, what would those things be? What would they look like?
You wanna go, Alice?
Sure, but you have to think of some too. Okay.
Oh yeah, I love Ricky's like, I'm softballs only, please. I don't think so.
Ricky and I complement each other well. Okay. So one of the things I tell undocumented students to do when they are trying to find colleges that are a good fit is to Google the name of the school and the word undocumented, right? Like, hopefully that can always be something. For the vast majority of schools, what shows up is a statement of support after the DACA rescission in 2017 or some professor's research. So it would be awesome. And I realize with the UNC system schools, there are a lot of pressures. I don't know what your communications team and what your admissions office ethos is and all of that. But to the extent possible, there can be an FAQ on your website that uses the word undocumented. Most of the students who are in high school right now have not had access to DACA. And even if it opened tomorrow, it's really only maybe high school seniors and a few juniors who would qualify because of the criteria you had to meet in terms of your arrival date and how long you need to have been here and all that stuff. So DACA, while awesome, that's like 30-year-olds and not teenagers at this point, statistically. So use the word undocumented. If there, I had the privilege of being on the Common Application Working Group about citizenship a couple of years ago that looked at the question on the Common Application. And it's a tough nut to crack when you look at like the systemic stuff that happens behind the scenes in a college admissions office, right? Like non-citizen, please send email asking for certificate of foreign or certificate of financial responsibility. Please send email asking for student visa. If there's anything you can do on the back end of that process to make sure that undocumented students are not receiving messages that were meant for truly international students, like students who grew up abroad, that would be helpful. And in terms of that FAQ, so one is like an FAQ for what if I'm undocumented, right? I think everyone appreciates clear and accessible, transparent information. So if the FAQ means like, sorry, you're not eligible for any of our institutional financial aid, like say that. You can say it nicely, you can say it however you need to say it. If they're not eligible for merit scholarships at your college, clearly state that, because the worst thing as an advisor or a family or a student is to not have the information, hope for the best, get in, and then be told you're not eligible for this scholarship program we have because you're not a student. So kind of an FAQ really spelling out what resources they have. Number two, any systemic thing you can do to make sure that the automated emails they get are accurate. And I just lost, there was a really, really thoughtful, please train your admission staff. And if you need help with that, I will put my email in the chat. Because the other thing, when I've worked with students, and they're like, I really want to apply to such and such college. And I'm like, and this is typically with out-of-state colleges, because at this point we know most of the policies of the private schools within North Carolina, but they'd be like, I want to apply to this school in Virginia. And I'm like, I don't think they have aid for you, but sure, I'll call. And so I call and I talk to the frontline person, and I realize I've worked in college admissions. Like I know, like sometimes that's staffed by students. You don't like, there's lots of different levels of who the person is answering that phone. When I say I'm working with an undocumented student who is not eligible to fill out the FAFSA, do you have any institutional financial aid? I often got incorrect answers, or answers that were not understanding what it meant when I said the word undocumented. And so I could push back because I know, and because I have privilege and I have power, and I can say, well, no, actually, I know this child cannot fill out the FAFSA. Like that is not an option for this student. But instead of saying, I'm actually not sure, can I call you back? Can I send you up the chain? Like whatever it needs to be. I just would get a lot of information that wasn't accurate. So making sure that like students would rather hear like, no, we don't have anything, than to get misinformation. Yeah, so that is, those are kind of the three things that come to mind. And oh my gosh, if you have resources, if you have like a legal resource team that helps students file DACA, because there are more DACA students actually in college right now, or you do have scholarships that are open to students regardless of status, but you get a lot of those like automatic merit scholarships at this GPA, but like the fine print is like, no, actually not. It's hard. It's not easy, but if I get a magic wand, and then I don't know if Ricky wants to add anything to that.
You covered all the bases, which is why I wanted to let you go first. I mean, the ones I would cite, right, in terms of small policy tweaks aren't so small, right? But I think it's important for folks to know, right, a lot of what folks are asking for, especially on the driver's license front, if we want to revisit that topic. This isn't some brave new world, right? We're just like some radical new policy idea. Immigrants had driver's license up until 2007 in North Carolina. So it was actually a privilege, a right, in my opinion, that was taken away, not one that's never been given. And so that I think is something that folks forget or aren't aware of, that a lot of the policies that folks are asking for is sort of a reversion back to what used to be, right? And a lot of what's happened is the conversation has changed, right? I think people were largely on board a decade and a half ago because it was a public safety issue. People thought that it was important that everyone driving in North Carolina should have access to identification and driver's license, because it also has implications for insurance, for example. And if someone were to hit you, for example, you would want to know who that person is and to make sure that that person was liable for coverage, right? So it's just little things like that where people don't often connect the dots on sort of what it is and why it matters, and also how it impacts education.
I just want to highlight in the chat, Jane Ann had a great point. Jane Ann, pitch in anytime you want to. Having Spanish speakers available to help families with FAFSA completion, if your institution provides that kind of help. And I think just in general, one of the things that colleges can start to really do in terms of, and this is something, if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of our post-SCOTUS world that will be coming down the pike in June. Hopefully we'll see exactly what they decide, is having more outreach from your institution to help students fill out your application, and also understanding what your application looks like. The other thing I want to say about the driver's license piece is, particularly again in the post-SCOTUS world that we're approaching, this new paradigm, that, holistic admission. So a lot of the admissions offices that I've been on calls with recently, it's been a lot of talk about, well, we do holistic admission. So we look at all these other different pieces. But a piece of the holistic admission is always students' extracurriculars, right? But I think if a student can't get to the extracurriculars, I think it's that understanding of what is life like on the ground for these students, right? Like, what can they actually access? And this goes beyond the coursework that they can access, right? It's not just, can you get to AP Calc, right, in your high school? It's, do you have to work a job because your family needs you to work a job? And so you can't do all the clubs and NHS and track and whatever else. And so I think having a better understanding of what that looks like for students in their application process, and not sort of docking points against a student because they don't have 10 activities in their Common App, but understanding what that life looks like. They don't have a driver's license, they can't get one. These pieces I think are important parts of if you're really looking holistically at a student, you need to understand the holistic view of their world, right? And the kinds of challenges that they have. So if I had a request for the transparency piece, number one for me, for colleges, if they could be just much more transparent, this is what is the real deal. But I think in holistic admissions, just really having a better understanding of what life is like day to day for students, I think is really important, particularly first gen students who come from under-resourced areas, like historically marginalized populations. What does that life look like every day?
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for bringing that up. And looking at folks on this call, I'm guessing, even though I don't know all of you, like, this is something that whether you're on the high school or college side, you're super aware of. And I just know that even with our Spanish speaking coaches, drawing this information out from students and saying, like, well, what does your typical day look like? What can we put in that common application? Like, sometimes it takes so long. Students in general, right, don't always see all that they do and all that they are and all that they can be. And that's why we're educators and we're counselors. We help them make those connections, right? So I think this is like a case in point where, like, what's best for our students who identify as Latinx or any BIPOC student, it's better for everybody, right? Like, if Leandra is going to, if we could fund it, it makes it better for everybody, right? If holistic admissions truly cares about all of these nuances in a student's application, that helps everybody. It helps my kid, and so recommendations that we're making are not like, oh, well, this will serve the Latino kids. Like, no, it serves everybody to get that kid to recognize that their role as a translator in their family, their role as the licensed driver in the family, their role as like the right-hand person at the parent-teacher conference, the filling out the forms, all this stuff. Those are leadership skills. We have a lot of oldest sisters in LatinxEd who have the role of oldest sister in their families. And that is, that is a special role. if you haven't seen Encanto, go, see that. I think a lot of them identified with some of those roles. It's a huge, it's a tremendous amount of responsibility and weight. Ricky's a middle child, so he doesn't get to, Ricky doesn't get to weigh in on this.
Can you tell we've had this conversation before about eldest versus middle children?
So the other population that I would love you to speak to, if you had a magic wand, right? So there are those of us who are independent education consultants who are working with high schoolers. There are people who are high school counselors. If you had a magic wand for sort of the things that you wish they knew that we knew, or things that we would change about our practice or sort of incorporate, or like so your other magic wand for a different population, what would those things be, do you think?
Ricky, I'm going to make you talk about this because you were in that seat, probably needing help from folks along the way.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what we discuss with the Undocumented Carolina training in this conversation, I feel like is relevant, right? I mean, I'm a first generation college student, right? My parents, weren't undocumented when I was in school, but did come to this country undocumented, right? And so there's this like intersection, right, of identities between race, class, ethnicity, immigration status that is like really challenging to unpack, right? And I think people in your shoes don't need to feel the weight of having to unpack all of that with us, right? I think it's important to recognize it, but also like as much as I love Alice in my adult life, would I have like connected with Alice when I was younger? I don't know, right? Like, or with anyone on this call, right? And sort of the role of sort of that village is really important for our students, right? And so like I think the faster we can recognize that there are resources in our communities that oftentimes we can triage some of these things, like we know that conversation needs to happen, but is it happening quick enough, right, is always our challenge, right? Like we have a limited window, right, to have so many of these conversations as we sort of prepare for college. And I think that's an important component of that as we think about how we make sure that we're not just supporting each student, but also sort of weaving that social fabric that supports each one of our students along the way.
And I would just add to that, don't forget about the caregivers and parents. I am not bilingual. That makes it much harder for me to do my job, which is also why I don't do the direct student services at this point. I'm not the right person to be doing that, but I also know that a lot of schools don't have a Spanish speaker. There's not enough translators. Maybe there's no translator in your district, and you can't just ask the Spanish teacher to help every time. And so I know it's harder, but don't let that be the reason you don't engage parents. Just because it may be harder for you to communicate to them if you are not a Spanish speaker, doesn't mean that they don't bring just as much to the table, that they don't care just as much about their child's trajectory. Often their hopes and dreams for their children are tied up into their immigration story. The parents I've met are as incredible as any of the students I've helped. And so it's harder, and you can't leave them behind. You have to bring them to the table too.
Yeah.
Can you just talk quickly about, you mentioned, Ricky, earlier, something about advocacy days?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so there's a group, a coalition of Latino serving organizations and other community leaders called Adelante, which is hosting an advocacy day. I believe it's April 5th, where they're going to be talking about tuition equity with legislators. I don't know if your advocacy day has already passed for SACAC or if there's one coming up.
Yeah, we're not doing a head to the Capitol. I was like, the place with the building. So that it's,
Yeah.
we're not doing one this year because we sort of have done a lot of the direct outreach to people who are in the House committees. So the House,
Gotcha.
yeah, which is how I first met you. And so, but we love to support other folks' advocacy
Yep.
days. The other issue, and you wouldn't necessarily know this, is that NACAC is not doing the national advocacy, sort of the one that typically has happened in March. So we're sort of trying to figure out like what those are going to look like going forward. But we absolutely would love to know about and support.
Yeah, we can certainly, I think Alice has dropped it in the chat, but we can provide more context if needed in a follow-up email to your group. I mean, even if it's not on this day, I think, like I mentioned, this is actually a session where we could really advance the conversation around tuition equity. So we would really love your help in advancing that conversation. So even if it's an email or phone call to your legislator, even if you go visit on your own, if you happen to be in Raleigh and you want to make an hour just to swing by, there are certainly targets, but in general, just making sure that your legislator knows that this is an issue that's important to you, I think can make a world of difference this session as conversations pick back up. What I've learned over the years is that this issue is fairly popular. It's a common sense, pragmatic approach. We just have a challenge of no champions in the arena, right? And I think that the more that legislators know that their colleagues actually are pretty supportive of this, or that there's people in the community that care about it, it'll be a little easier for them to publicly support an issue like tuition equity. We just got to get them all in the same room at the same time eventually. But from all the conversations we've had over the years, like, folks, I think if it ever hit the floor, like, it would pass because it's got majority support. There's just a few holdouts that hold a lot of power that don't want to see it sort of see the light of day. But I think we're inching closer than I would have anticipated this year. So I'm actually rather optimistic that we can do something this year.
And if folks are interested in learning more about how to find your legislators and how to reach out to them, the recording that will go out from yesterday's session, which was Advocacy 101, will be coming out later this week. And we will also be sharing the slideshow presentation that we did yesterday that has like so many slides and so many links, but that lots of ways for you to find who you should be reaching out to, who their aides are. That's a really important piece of it, I think, and how to sort of craft some of those approaches to legislators. So
I can just say one thing about the link that I dropped. The Adelante Lobby Day is really aimed at youth. So I realized like people on this call are like, wait, that's a Wednesday. I can't get out of work. They certainly are going to have adults, but more in a chaperoning capacity. This is really a youth-led thing. And I do know that there is transportation from Charlotte. So for students, so if any of you are in the Charlotte area, and I think that's being run through our Turn NC. So if you work with students in the Charlotte area, they may be able to hook into a free ride to the state capitol. And I hope to be there. So if you're there, I'll see you.
Well, I want to make sure we're respectful of your time and for everyone who's here, their time. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I have literally like 4 notebooks that, because I kept like moving them about sort of like to different places, like I have notes about this. Thank you so much. This is amazing work. And we've dropped, I tried to put links to LatinxEd and to Undocumented Carolina, the fellowship. I put all of those into the chat if people are interested in looking those up some more. But we are so deeply appreciative of your time and your work. And it's just really nice to always see you. And we hope that we will continue these conversations and supporting you, SACAC supporting you in this really important work over, the coming months. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a really wonderful week. Thank you so much to everyone who was here today. Last Lunch and Learn is tomorrow with folks from Discolored and the Yes She Can campaign to talk about scholarship displacement. And we are just so grateful for you spending your afternoon with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Deb. Bye, Jane Ann.